One of the biggest advantages people have when analyzing a criminal interrogation after the fact is something called outcome awareness. When we already know whether a suspect is guilty or innocent, it becomes much easier to focus on behaviors that support that conclusion. Details that may have seemed confusing in real time suddenly appear obvious once the outcome is known. Most people are familiar with the idea that hindsight makes everything look clearer. But what's interesting is that this principle often becomes even more revealing when examining innocent individuals rather than guilty ones. The reason is simple. A guilty person may intentionally mislead investigators, conceal information, or manipulate perceptions. Their behavior can be influenced by strategy, deception, or self-preservation. An innocent person usually has far fewer reasons to do any of those things. As a result, their reactions tend to be more direct and easier to interpret. Of course, human behavior is never perfectly predictable. People respond to stress, fear, and trauma in different ways. Some remain calm, others become emotional, some appear detached, while others become angry or frustrated. There will always be exceptions. However, investigators often find that genuinely innocent behavior and deceptive behavior tend to leave very different impressions when viewed in context. To better understand this distinction, consider the case of Michael Dixon. At the time, Michael was 37 years old and known by friends and coworkers as quiet, approachable, and reserved. He openly described himself as an introvert and even avoided certain career opportunities because he disliked being the center of attention. On the evening of August 15, 2003, police in Hamilton, Ontario responded to reports of a break-in at a jewelry store. Officers arrived quickly and pursued a suspect through a nearby alleyway. During the chase, they temporarily lost sight of the individual. At nearly the same moment, Michael Dixon was returning home from work after getting off a nearby bus. When officers emerged from the alley, Michael happened to be the first person they saw. Within moments, he found himself facing armed police officers and was placed under arrest. Despite repeatedly insisting he had nothing to do with the crime, Michael remained cooperative throughout the encounter. He did not resist, he did not flee. Instead, he told investigators he was willing to answer questions and help clarify what had happened. Several hours later, he was brought into an interview room for formal questioning. What followed would become a remarkable example of how innocent people sometimes react when confronted with overwhelming accusations. From the very beginning, investigators treated the case as if Michael's guilt had already been established. The detective informed him that the evidence was supposedly overwhelming and suggested that the purpose of the interview was no longer to determine whether he committed the crime, but rather to understand why. For many people, such an accusation would trigger panic, anger, or disbelief. Yet Michael's response was noticeably different. He remained calm. He maintained steady eye contact. His posture communicated confidence rather than fear. In fact, some observers later noted that the detective appeared more uncomfortable than the suspect. Behavioral analysts often pay close attention to these subtle interactions because confidence and deception do not always look the way people expect. Movies frequently portray guilty individuals as nervous and innocent individuals as relaxed. Real life is rarely that simple. As the questioning continued, Michael consistently repeated the same message. He denied involvement, he answered questions directly, and he showed little interest in arguing with investigators beyond insisting on the truth. What made the situation particularly unusual was his patience. Many innocent suspects become visibly frustrated when confronted with false accusations. Michael, however, seemed remarkably composed despite facing the possibility of serious criminal charges. His reaction stood out precisely because it differed from what investigators typically encounter. And that contrast becomes even more interesting when compared to other cases involving innocent suspects who responded in a completely different way.